Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome back after that short break. Hopefully you can hear me. If you can't, please chuck it in the chat as you have done before. So my name's Deborah. A lot of you know me already from Community Southwark. I'm the Director of Development and Partnerships. For those of you who weren't here earlier and may not know, Community Southwark is the infrastructure organisation for the Borough of Southwark. So we basically exist to support and advocate for the voluntary and community sector, from individuals getting involved in social action, volunteering, all the way through to established charities and everything in between. If you do want any more information, please look on our website. So our next session is about joint working and the future. And as you all know, we are living in extraordinary times at the moment, and the response so far has often been described itself as extraordinary. But I do wonder if this is the right word to describe it. To me, the response that we've seen is what the voluntary and community sector does, and does really well. We respond really fast, we respond to need, and we're flexible as much as we can be within our funding. And everything we do is based around communities and what they want. What has been extraordinary is the huge scale of this crisis, and the fact that it has highlighted and exacerbated many of the issues that our communities are already facing, as well as creating some new ones. But it's also provided us with a really clear point at which to change the way we think about what we do and the way we do it. It's also changed some of the conversations that we've been having and who's been in those conversations. So the hope now is that all of this change could create some really excellent long-term solutions to some of the issues we've all been facing in the voluntary and community sector, across the NHS, within the council, and how we work together. So that's what we're going to focus on until 1 o'clock, when we'll break for lunch. So we have Ross from Age UK, Mike from Pembroke House, and Stephen from Southwark Council, here to discuss the response so far, some of the challenges that we've seen, and then look at some of the future needs emerging from this and ways of working going forward. So what we're going to do is each person is going to introduce themselves and cover a little bit about the response so far from their point of view. Then we're going to have 3 key questions that each panelist is going to have an opportunity to answer. Throughout all of this, please add your questions to the Q&A section or chat if you're finding that difficult. And we'll take some questions from the floor in all the space that we have left. Anything that isn't answered now, don't worry, this isn't the end of these conversations, this is just the beginning. This is an opportunity to start some of this, but we would really love you to join our networks, to email us, bombard us with information and ideas about what you think the future of working together and responding to community needs are going to be. So we will get started with 5 minutes on the clock each. So could we start with Ross from Age UK, please? Remember to unmute yourself.
Thank you, Deborah. Hi, everybody. So yeah, I'm Ross. I'm the Chief Exec of Age UK, Lewisham and Southwark. I've been in post since December, so fairly steep learning curve. Anyway, my background is I'd worked in CVSs and volunteer centres, so similar to Community Southwark. So quite a challenge to come into this post, and then to be hit by COVID has been quite an extraordinary time. As Deborah says, the voluntary sector, always claims to be quick, responsive, flexible, person-centred, and we've absolutely proved it, I think, in Southwark and elsewhere locally. So that's been a really fantastic response from everybody. Just very quickly, in terms of Age UK, talk about quickly what we've done as an example of how the voluntary sector's had to change. So some of you may know we have 2 day centres in the borough, including one for people with dementia. So we closed those very quickly for the safety of the members and so on. We've expanded our bespoke shopping service Food to You and kept our urgent handy person scheme going. But other than that, everything else now is over the phone and online. So we supported all our staff to be able to work from home on telephone. So if you phone the main Age UK line, you will get distraction from teenage boy having to work from home. If you phone the main line, you'll get diverted to one of the our staff who are able to take calls directly from that. We're delivering around 500 hot meals a week for people. The meals are donated to us by Fooditude and Bermondsey Community Kitchen, which is not something we've been doing specifically before, but it means we've been flexible with the staff that were originally driving people to and from the day centre. We've developed activity packs, both online and hard copy ones for people. We've been doing somewhere around 3,000 welfare check calls on people we've been involved with. We're setting up a shop and drop service, a bit like the mutual aid schemes, to cover areas where they don't currently exist. Working with GP care navigation, which links to the session that happened this morning around social prescribing. And against all of that stuff, we're setting up a brand new older people and carers hub in the borough in partnership with a number of local voluntary groups that we work with for older people and carers. So that's a huge piece of work, and that gives some potential scope for joint working. So I think the fact that Southwark has commissioned that, I think talks to the fact that we're kind of ahead of the game in a sense locally, where they've been thinking already about partnership working between the voluntary sector, different groups working together, and us working with the council and the NHS to provide a really sort of strong service for local people. So I will stop there and hand over back to Deborah.
Thank you. I was just giving you your 2-minute warning. Okay. In which case, could Mike introduce himself now, please?
Yeah, hello everyone. So I'm Mike. I'm the director of Pembroke House, which is one of the settlements in the borough. So we are in Walworth, just south of Elephant and Castle. I think a lot like Ross is saying, you know, I think the response from the voluntary sector has been brilliant. I think the way that people have responded flexibly, rapidly, and quickly to the situation has been amazing. Mm-hmm. I think also, you know, and I know the focus of this session is on joint working, and I think my sort of headline here is that I think what we've been able to do with the council and the CCG, and we've had ups and downs along the way, as you'd expect, but I think what we've been able to do in terms of integration is we've moved forward maybe further in the last sort of 6, 7, 8 weeks than we have in the 6 years that I've been here previously. So we've often been around conversations, around tables, talking about how we can work together for the benefit of the borough. I guess there's nothing like a crisis to actually mean that you put some of that into action. And I think what we've done is we've moved away from just sitting around tables talking to actually setting up new ways of working together, which I think lay the foundation for the future and lay some really exciting opportunities for us to develop things in the longer term. I mean, I think in terms of what Pembroke House has done, yeah, same as Ross, we had to close activities very quickly. We're usually a multi-use community centre and neighbourhood organisation, so we closed activities. We've flipped our work very quickly into food distribution, seeing that food insecurity was going to be the sort of first real sort of symptom of this crisis in the face of that first phase of the crisis. So we've been delivering food with volunteers on bikes in and around the Walworth area over the last 6 to 8 weeks as a sort of emergency food bank. That's not our normal work. It's not also work that I think we want to see in the longer term. We don't want to see a borough where we need these type of food banks. So I think now we're beginning to think about, okay, what's the next phase of this? How do we move away from just solving that first initial crisis around food insecurity to start tackling some of the root causes of why is it that this crisis has just tipped so many people who were just on the cusp of coping over into crisis, and what's the longer term work that we can do to address some of the causes of food insecurity and some of the other vulnerabilities that we're seeing. So that's what we've done locally. We're also running a range of online activities from our virtual Walworth Living Room website and some neighbourhood resources for the Walworth SE17 area. Then we've been very much involved along with Community Southwark, with Ross representing Copsins and others, working with the council to sort of kick up and to get this community hub response up and running, and in particular to look at the way that we can integrate the council's initiatives with those of the voluntary sector and also those of health partners. So over those, and that's where I think we have seen some real progress over the last few weeks. But I think the key for that has been about coordinating responses and looking at the way that we can make sure that we're not duplicating effort and trying to make as quick, as swift and easy referral pathways and processes as possible. I think one of the things we saw at the very beginning of this was that actually all of us were struggling, having to close buildings and having to close normal operations. So one of the key first things that we had to do at the very beginning was try and get an up-to-date view of what was happening in the borough, what services were available, and where could people be referred to for help. So with Community Southwark, we've done a lot of work looking at ways of mapping existing capacity in the borough and developing a sort of a bit more of an authoritative database of the services that are currently available to which the health partners and the council can refer to. I think, looking to the future, that's really the topic of this discussion today over this session. But I think for me, we've learned a lot in these 8 weeks, and we've done a lot very, very quickly. I think there are lessons both in positives and negatives that we should learn from. But I think critically for me, there's an opportunity here to lay the foundations out of this emergency response for a long-term legacy, to try and bed in some of the sort of green shoots of real collaboration that we've seen emerge, and some of the sort of dynamism that we've seen in the sector as well. How can we make sure that those are not just responses that are in these crisis times, but actually opportunities that we can build on over the longer term?
Thank you, Mike. Bang on time. And so now could we bring in Stephen, please? The same intro, please.
Thank you, Deborah. I'm Stephen Douglas. I'm Director of Communities at the Council in my day job. And for the last few weeks, I've been the Council's programme lead on the Community Hub that was established to look out for the welfare needs of vulnerable people in the wake of the COVID-19 pandemic. And we've really actually been doing things we've never done before, or doing them in a very different way to the way we've done them before. I think the first thing to say, and this has been touched on by other speakers, is thank you. It's been a huge effort that's involved volunteers right across communities, health staff, social care staff, staff in established voluntary and community sector organisations, and staff coming together from right across the council. So we've repurposed all sorts of people who haven't been doing the day jobs into doing stuff like making welfare calls, food deliveries, or supporting food deliveries that are going out through VCS organisations. And that's been an absolutely amazing effort. And for me, I mean, that's the first thing. We've collaborated, as I think Mike touched on there, like we never have before. And I'm really interested, and we're now starting to think at how do we build on that, and how do we keep that going moving forward? So really interested in everyone's views on that. It really, and again, this has been touched on before, demonstrates what we can achieve. In a matter of days, we set up a substantial food distribution network. From the council end, now about 1,500 food parcels a week, but not just food, other essential supplies, local work through local voluntary and community sector hubs, and Mike referred to Pembroke House having repurposed what they were doing to support food delivery. And of course, this isn't just about food. Also looked out for the wider health and well-being needs of people who were either shielding. It's not just about people who are shielding because they fall into those categories of people who are clinically extremely vulnerable, but a much wider group of vulnerable people across the borough who were self-isolating. And it's really shone a light on the levels of food insecurity, but also the levels for me of isolation, of people who had no access to support, either from friends, neighbours, or were in touch with any of the existing organisations that were there to provide that support. So I'm really interested in the lessons we've learned from that way of working. We established a very substantial new front door, effectively, so a way for people to contact or be referred in to us, and of course to be making, as has been mentioned by Ross, proactive calls to actually tens of thousands of vulnerable residents to check on their welfare, and that's been absolutely incredible. I'm not the techie person, but one of the things we've developed and looks very promising is the Airtable, which is used for making referrals through to a range of voluntary and community sector services, and we're really pleased to support the development of that. As I said, one of the aims of the hub was to meet the welfare needs of tens of thousands of vulnerable people across the borough. And there's a really wide range of stuff which I can come back to later when we get into the questions and discussions. As I've said, this isn't just about those who were on the shielded lists that central government sent us. In that case, it's about 10,000 residents in Southwark, but we deliberately took a much wider view of vulnerability and who was likely to be impacted. People right across the council have also been involved in making those welfare calls. Our housing officers have called about 10,000 residents living in council housing. Our contact centre have contacted just under 3,000 smart service users. Teams right across the council have been doing those welfare checks to add to the work that's been happening within the voluntary and community sector. The last thing I'll say is that the hub, of course, is just one part of the council's response. We're also providing support for businesses. There's been a lot of work done in that area. Hardship funds for residents. And there's also been things like additional funding streams available to the voluntary and community sector in response to COVID-19. The work of the hub, of course, isn't over as people start talking about lockdown easing, and return to normal is probably the wrong way to put it. But it's likely that the people we're dealing with will continue to need that support, and we're planning on continuing to do that for quite some time, even if that means, and we're looking at how we sustain that in a different way. So how do we learn the lessons of the collaborative working, the opportunities that Mike referred to for the future, to do this in a different way, in a new world that, amongst other things, is likely to mean for the council less resources being available, despite the response to COVID-19.
Sorry, I'm going to have to interrupt you there just for a second. Your time was up on that, but actually you've started to go into my second question. So perhaps we could just carry on with the second question, starting with you, Stephen. Which are about some of the challenges that local people, organisations, sort of more for Mike and Ross, and the council have faced during COVID.
Just in terms of challenges that residents have faced, and we have been doing some analysis on this. As I touched on earlier, that isn't just about food. I mean, this has shone a light on levels of food insecurity, but it's a huge range of things. And just looking at the calls that come into our contact centre, the top 5 there: food, help with shopping. We're now moving into, and we do have a number of priority delivery slots with supermarkets, but assisting people with that. Business support I've mentioned, we get lots of calls about that. Money, whole range of financial worries. That might be, I'm self-isolating, I can't get out to get my pension, or I can't top up my electricity meter. So we've been offering support and advice with that. Concern about carers, some of carers haven't turned up, those sorts of things, down to people who are lonely and need someone to talk to, lonely and concerned about their situation, just need someone to talk to. There's also in there medical needs, everything down to I'm self-isolating and I need help exercising my dog. So there's those sorts of things where we've been able to provide people with support. We're also, I think, starting to see a shift in this. So some of this was about immediate kind of crisis support. We're also thinking about how will this change longer term, economic impacts, people who've lost their employment, the longer term impacts of isolation and lockdown, and how do we meet those needs. In terms of challenges for the council, it's been an enormous effort, and from our end, it's probably about 200 people across the council who we've repurposed to do this piece of work. There will be challenges as the demands in other areas of the business start to grow again. So for example, our housing repairs teams, we're focusing only on emergency repairs, so minimizing going into people's properties in this period. And we use them to be doing stuff like deliveries of food. So we've repurposed people and assets, but there will be pressure for them to go back. And likewise, I know the voluntary sector, and Mike touched on this, has done the same thing. And again, is there loads of pent-up demand there? But as I say, also many opportunities moving forward. What have we learned from this, and how do we make sure we don't lose some of those positive things about the collaboration?
Thank you, Stephen. And could I bring Mike and Ross into this if they have any points to add on challenges being faced?
Happy to go first, Mike, if that's helpful. Yeah, I think one of the big issues is that so much of what we do at Age UK and a lot of the voluntary sector is about face-to-face. It's about community building and dealing with social isolation. That's one of the first things that's had to stop. And social isolation, as we know, causes a whole range of issues, health issues, mental health issues. And so the whole crisis has made that worse. So that's a massive challenge. And we're beginning to think about how we might be able to do some social distance befriending. We're doing befriending calls, but we're thinking about now, you know, you can stand outside somebody's house 2 or 3 meters away, those kind of things. So that's a kind of key challenge. But for people, huge amounts of anxiety. We would speak to people who initially said they were fine and didn't need another call, and then 2 or 3 weeks later they started to panic, or panic's maybe too strong, but be worried. And some of that's about food and other shopping supplies, cleaning goods, all those kind of things. Access to cash is a big problem for people who can't get out the house. You know, you can get a volunteer to drop off some shopping for you, but you don't want to be giving them your bank card and sending them off to the cash point machine. So whole range of issues. I think poverty is going to get worse of the impacts of the crisis on the economy. So yeah, huge amounts of complicated challenges. We know, you know, domestic violence and other things are likely to be on the rise. So it's a massive challenge. And as I say, one of the things we would normally do with all of that is speak to people face to face. So the other big challenge for us as this thing continues is trying to get more people access to online services, so more people who've got smartphones where they can see somebody and talk to their family, but also, you know, voluntary and community groups starting to do things in a different way. Some people have that, but there's a big chunk of people that really don't. I think that's a massive challenge for us going forward.
Yeah, I'd agree with all of that. I mean, I think the thing that we're seeing in terms of challenges for local people and residents, definitely food insecurity was the first phase of this, but I think that it's now moving into real concerns that are underpinning that. So a concern about the furlough scheme has that just delayed rather than prevented redundancies. So a lot of people worried about job prospects. A lot of people in insecure employment who weren't able to access the furlough scheme, and actually this has tipped them into the edge. Particular groups of people under the radar of traditional services, so people with no recourse to public funds, particular communities locally who haven't felt either comfortable or able to access certain of the support that's on offer. And then I think the huge, really significant has been families. So we've done a lot of work with local schools and seeing, families for whom school is really a lifeline, families who are below the social care threshold, but for whom school and the support that they get through their local schools, including food, but obviously much more than that, being a real lifeline. And actually those families really struggling without that support at the moment. So I've done quite a lot of work with the education team and also some local primary schools like Surrey Square School in Walworth. So those are, those are in terms of some of the things that we're seeing from local residents. I think the other key thing that we're looking at the moment, I think we're all looking at this, is we're through this sort of first phase of the crisis where there's been a huge amount of goodwill and people wanting to help out, volunteer. There's been a significant amount of sort of emergency funding available. What happens now as lockdown begins to ease and some of those furloughed volunteers go back to their day jobs? What happens as some of that emergency funding begins to get used up? If the need is going to continue to go up, and we predict it probably will based on what's likely to happen with the economy, then there's going to be a gap, an even greater gap now between capacity to help and the need that we have in the borough. So that's some of the things we're anticipating this next phase of the crisis, in these various adaptations of lockdown being some of the most challenging. And I think that's going to be one that's going to really focus the minds. I think, can I just say something about organisations, Deborah? Because I think we've talked about residents. I think organisationally, I think we've seen huge strain on organisations who have had to adapt to do their work in very, very different ways. And I think Ross has raised that point about the voluntary sector in particular. Its real sort of raison d'etre often is that face-to-face contact and some of that community building work. How to do that in this situation has been a real challenge. I think the other thing that we've seen is funding. So we've seen emergency funding come up. Actually funding for normal activities and thinking about what we might do in phase 2 and phase 3 has been a little bit more difficult. I think the other thing that we've seen, almost paradoxically, is some of the organisations who have been hit the most here have been organisations that probably were doing the thing we were all told to do about growing earned income streams. So where you had earned income streams and you diversified income, actually they dropped out, so people are really struggling. And then there's the sort of work that we need to do in order to sort of make sure that this work is sustainable in the long term and to link in with those sort of myriad local organisations and groups that are doing work like TRAs, like mutual aid groups locally, and how can we actually sort of work together and alongside each other in the most creative and mutually supportive way. And I think we've got pockets of where that's worked really, really well in the borough. I think we've also got areas where we haven't seen that dovetail between the two, and we need to do a lot more work together to work out how we can align those different groups.
Brilliant, thank you, Mike. We've sort of answered question 2 in amongst all that, so I let it run on a little bit. There's quite a few good comments that I thought might be a good opportunity to bring in because they match up with that, and then we'll move on to talking about some ideas that we have for how we might move forward and work differently together. So just a few questions. First of all, someone is trying to make sense of Elemental platform versus Airtable platform and asking if they're connected. So first of all, just to demystify Airtable, it is just a database, and Elemental is a different type of database. Elemental was chosen as what's going to be used for social prescribing during the networks that I think the speakers talked about earlier on. So it's still going to be used for social prescribing. Airtable is a very quick and easy platform that we used to try and get together all of the services that are still operating in Southwark so that we could have a really easy referral pathway through the community hub. And I'll explain a little bit about the community hub because there is a question about that as well. So Airtable is going to continue to be Community Southwark's kind of membership database, basically. So we hope to gather every single organisation, what they do, where they do it, and be able to provide that information to others. For the moment, it's just got everyone working on the COVID response on it. There is possibilities to connect Airtable database to other databases. So that's a conversation that we'll be having going forward as we kind of look deeper into social prescribing and the emergency response changes from emergency into looking at how we move forward, and Elemental will be a part of that. But there's obviously technical bits to do around that, but we hope that they will be connected up to some level. So I hope that answered that, Iona. The community hub, someone has just asked for a brief explanation. So the community hub was basically when the government announced, and Stephen, please do jump in if I get anything wrong here, when the government announced that local authorities would be providing food parcels for the shielded list, the community hub was Southwark Council's response to that. Southwark Council have worked with the NHS and the voluntary sector, and a decision was made to have it as one point of entry. So rather than the local authority just dealing with the shielded list and then the voluntary sector dealing with everyone else, it was decided we would have one phone number to make it super easy for everyone. They contact the community hub, and then depending on whether you're shielded or not and what your problem is, you would get referred to the right place in the council, NHS, or voluntary and community sector. And Airtable is being used as a way of collating, as I said earlier, all of the voluntary and community sector organisations that the council can refer to. So I hope that clears it up. If you're not on that Airtable and you think you're running services that should be on it, please do just contact us and we can send you a link to input your details to that. Okay, let me just check. There were a few others. I know I said we'd do this at the end, but some of them are more related to what we just talked about. Beth from North Bermondsey Community Sport has asked, something my mutual aid group is really struggling with at the moment is getting a rapid response on cases of some people who need longer term care at home, financial support and safeguarding concerns. So they are wondering, what can they do to make sure that they're in the system and no one is slipping through the cracks? So I think that one is to obviously the council because of their systems, but it might be a little bit to everyone, and how can the community sector actually make sure that people aren't slipping through the cracks, and we are supporting mutual aid groups to get those people to the right place. There is a question, I think this will lead into our next question, so maybe take a note, is about how to avoid duplicated effort. And how do we make sure there is overall coordination of any efforts going forward? Okay, I think the rest are pretty much copies of some of those questions. So we will move on to our sort of final talking point, other than other questions, which is about the future. So thinking about everything we've learned, all of the lessons that we keep talking about, and the challenges we've seen, how do you think we could continue to respond to this and other possible emergencies that will arise going forward? And what do you think could be the form any continued joint working could take between the voluntary sector, different voluntary sector organisations, but also between the voluntary sector, the council and the NHS? So if I could go to Ross first this time, please.
Thank you. I think very quickly to address the duplication issue, one of the issues surrounding that is data protection stuff. So it's really complicated. I know a number of people have been working very hard on it. It's difficult, but I think hopefully we can learn from this phase of the crisis and try and get it streamlined. It's very difficult to get consent and all those kind of things in terms of sharing data. So I mentioned earlier the new older people and carers hub that Age UK is setting up with a number of local charities, and we'll be working with the council. Once we can work in offices, we'll be co-locating some of our staff with some of the council staff. So it should be a more seamless service across the voluntary sector and the statutory sector. That will just be for older people and carers, but the model, that we're trialing and testing should be usable more broadly. So we're doing some of the data sharing agreements around that work now. So the one thing that worries me is this sense of a second spike, and whether that comes soon or in the winter, and how that works in correlation with flu that may come seasonally, and a sense that for some people this potentially could feel like it's kind of all over by the end of the summer, but there's going to be a huge cohort of people until such time as we get a vaccine that's available and effective, that this could rumble on for a long time and have a really long-term impact on those bits of the community that are encouraged not to go outside yet. So it feels like we're going to be in a different phase of this going forward, but one that's not going to be any easier, I think, for many of us to manage, even though maybe more complicated by the fact that a lot of people will think it's over and the pubs and shops and things will be open again. So it's going to be a slightly different one, and what we need to do is grab hold of the volunteering and all the goodwill that's around at the moment, and try and make sure we don't lose any of that. I know there was a session earlier today, the conference, looking at that, and it's really important that we try and do that and just keep encouraging people to talk to their neighbours. I've been seeing neighbours out clubbing every Thursday that I haven't seen for years. So I think there's lots of potential here, but hopefully we can learn through the hub we're doing with the council and our voluntary sector partners in the older people and carers sector. So hopefully there'll be lots of lessons learned already in terms of partnership. And I say part of it is GDPR, which is really complicated and time consuming, but also really important.
Thank you, Ross. So perhaps we could go to Stephen now. I know some of the previous questions as well of this one were sort of directed at you as well. So if you could answer some of those, and then going forward.
Yeah, happy to. Just on that issue of from North Bermondsey, was it Beth? I don't know if in that particular case a referral has been made into the community hub. There are a number of ways of doing that. Either on the phone, there's a dedicated email called covidsupport@southwark.gov.uk. There are web forms on the council website and elsewhere, and you can get to that through Community Southwark's website. There is no the referrals have already been made. Okay, well, if you can send me details of that specific referral or those referrals, I can look into that. Because my understanding is they're getting responses within 2 days and there's no significant backlog. So if something's gone wrong in that particular case, then I'll make sure that's dealt with. And that's the message to all those mutual aid groups. Please refer into the hub and we'll triage those and make sure they're passed on to the relevant service. In terms of the future working, and I think Ross's was a really good answer. As I said earlier, the collaboration so far has been brilliant. The older people in carers hub is one potential model that's really interesting, and having people across different sectors together, working more closely together, I think is a good thing. If you can work through all those boring but important issues about data sharing and all that sort of stuff. I think the point about the second and potentially subsequent spikes is a good one, and we need to try and retain the agility to step all of this back up if we need to at some point in the future. I think one key area of focus, again, has already been touched on, is this thing about volunteering, and it has been fantastic to see this kind of blooming of community support, and the mutual aid groups is one example of that. And how do we sustain that? It's always been really difficult to do in the past. The Olympics, different kind of situation, but that saw, I think it was 70,000 Olympic volunteers. My understanding is a lot of that has now dissipated. So it's really, really hard stuff to sustain, but we need to be working with the voluntary and community sector to look at how do we do that and what's the impact when people are returning to work is probably the wrong term, because lots of people have been, like us, working from home or elsewhere. But when people get back to whatever the new normal is and have other things that get in the way of that voluntary effort. So volunteering is certainly one area of focus as well.
Great. Thanks so much, Stephen. And Mike, over to you.
Thanks. I mean, I think I'll just pick up on that point of duplication, because I think there definitely has been duplication of effort, and I think we've seen that from the very beginning, duplication of effort, both within sectors and between them. And I think actually, you know, the key thing there is we've got to remember, you know, what I said at the beginning of almost, we've been talking about integration and we've been talking about working together for about 6 years around tables, and we've never really been able to do it. So actually where we started from was actually all of us pushing forward in our own way, and VCS doing one thing, pushing forward on their existing structures, health doing the same, council doing the same, and then this amazing upsurge of sort of mutual aid and then the TRAs moving forward. So we all had to work really quickly to respond to the very, you know, the immediacy of the crisis at the beginning. So that means, I think let's be honest, I think what we saw was a few horses bolt in different directions at the beginning. And I think the key thing is what we've been trying to do now is trying to pull some of those things into line to try and work out, okay, how can we begin to work across each other's resources to try and pull us pulling in the same direction. And I think that's where we, you know, there are some really nitty and gritty issues there around data protection, around sharing agreements, around databases, and we've already raised some of those questions in the session already today. I think the key lesson for me has been, look, what we really need, the crisis has pushed us forward quicker than we've gone before. And we've rallied around the crisis. We've got through some of those questions of data protection that normally would have taken months. We've got through them in a matter of weeks. And we've started to establish new referral pathways and new processes and new ways of working. The key thing for me is, how are we going to sustain that past this first initial phase? And we've rallied together around a crisis. What's the vision that's going to hold us together in the longer term? What's the way that what's the thing that we're going to rally around in Southwark that will try and help us hold together and push even further forward some of the integration that we have seen? And I think that really needs a clarity of vision and a clarity of leadership. I think there some of the work that needs to happen in that integration and that to avoid the duplication effort relies a bit of, you know, some of it's going to be goodwill, some of it's going to be knocking a few heads together. So we need that sort of vision and leadership to hold us together, and I think that's one of the key questions is what that's going to look like past initial crisis stage. I think the second thing in terms of avoiding duplication of effort, I think we did a huge amount of work to try and have a single front door for residents to come through that sort of council led front door at the early stages of this crisis. I think that took a huge amount of pressure off the front doors, some other front doors in the borough. But I think we need to think about how we're going to sustain and keep that, and how can that front door maybe be a model like you're talking about, Ross, with the Coxon's work and the Older People's Hub, be a genuinely unified front door that's operationally staffed by voluntary sector, health and council partners, as well as having representation of some of these community groups and mutual aid and TRA. So I think there's a really key question about how we keep that front door central and permanent, and also what it operationally looks like. And I think there is a whole suite of questions under there around databases and data protection, but I think seeing it as an operationally unified initiative is key. And then I think thirdly, and I think this picks up on some of the questions that we've had around sort of where in the borough has sort of integration with mutual or co-working with mutual aid groups and TRAs work really well. That type of work happens in our experience, best in neighbourhoods. You know, a lot of those mutual aid groups are neighbourhood-based mutual aid groups. The TRAs are obviously very localised. So the key is, how do we build a sort of neighbourhood infrastructure that can see those mutual aid groups, those TRAs, linking in with some of the sort of maybe more physical hubs in their local areas, and then let that feed into some of the work more centrally. So I think there are tiers to this based on a leadership and a clear vision, some sort of operational clear front door that is a unified response from the very beginning. And then thirdly, a way of seeing that work embedded in neighbourhoods and adapted to the different sort of demographics and the different qualities and characteristics of the different neighbourhoods in the borough.
Thank you so much, Mike. Okay, we are amazingly ahead of time, probably because we, as I forgot to mention at the beginning, we lost one of our panellists, Abby, through sickness. She was going to talk about food insecurity through Southwark's Food Action Alliance. So we have lost a panelist, which means we're 15 minutes ahead. So I'm just going to look through a few more of the questions and see if there's anything else, and then we'll go on to final points. Sorry, the questions keep going right up to the beginning again. I have to scroll all the way down. So there's quite a few comments about funding, which I think we've all come across as being a key issue. There has been a lot of funds available for emergency funding, and a lot to do direct food delivery supplies, but there's a lot of work around that maybe the funding hasn't been available for. So people's general jobs, some of the core aspects of working, and some of the issues that are coming up that we're seeing. There's a lot of comments about mental health, anxiety, that will only get bigger, and a lot around unemployment, where funding will be needed. So, and people have been, there's quite a few comments saying that they are applying for support funds but have found it really difficult to access. One of the other things that's coming up in a lot of questions, well, more comments I suppose, is about digital access as well, with everything being online at the moment, and that is quite difficult for some organisations and individuals to access support and funding. So something for us all to look at in the infrastructure and how we use digital and how we support others to get on board with digital there. There's a few around mutual aid groups and how they are involved in the different responses. One asking whether they're a part of the hub. Now, rightly or wrongly, I'm sure there'll be lots of opinions on this. It was decided that because mutual aid groups are all formed very differently and came up very naturally as grassroots volunteer type organisations to begin with, a decision was made that we wouldn't put them on the referral list and give an individual vulnerable person's name directly to that group. What we would do was signpost their local mutual aid group to the individual instead. Obviously, things might change. A lot of mutual aid groups are looking at becoming more formalised organisations and therefore could become a referral organisation. But because it's quite difficult to quality check different responses, it was felt that probably organisations that are known and have been quality checked and we sort of know what kind of work they do would be better directly linked to the community hub. But we do want to invite mutual aid groups to be a part of it, and we know you're part of a huge part of the wider response. And so I guess going forward, it's really thinking about, that was in the emergency response, how do we now think about mutual aid groups and how they get involved in supporting more volunteering, in supporting more very local community work, and whether they want to become more formalised. Another issue which has come up linked to that is all of the different organisations that have not been able to operate during COVID, and how do we help bring them back and support them. And this links to some of the duplication, because all mutual aid groups, the organisations that maybe have had to shut down, plus the organisations working now, we need us all to work together really well, which I think comes back to Mike's point about the neighbourhood infrastructure. So perhaps if I could get a few points from all of you on some of that. Sorry, it wasn't really a question, but and a final thought from everyone, that would be great. So if we could start with Mike this.
Yeah, I think that, I mean, I think the key, for me, I think we've said some of the key sort of learnings and lessons and thinking about how we can move forward. I think I'm really clear about I think we need to be working in a way that makes sure that we allow things to blossom rather than sort of wanting to sort of set everything into sort of these neat pathways. And I think the key thing around mutual aid and TRA groups is they have all developed in different ways, you know, and in the same way the VCS is not one thing. The VCS is many, many different types of organisations. Mutual aid is not one thing, and there are some mutual aid groups that have gone down one path, there are others that have gone down very different paths. I think the key thing, and I think the key thing that what we can't get in the way of is neighbours helping neighbours. And it's like the key, we don't want to sort of stand in any way of stopping some of that sort of amazing sort of neighbourhood work that all of us, I think, have been witness to in the areas that we live in, let alone areas where we work in. And I think that's the key thing. I think there's another set of questions that emerges when we're thinking about sort of formal referral routes from a sort of for a very particularly vulnerable individual, maybe that has been identified, maybe to a GP surgery or to the council or to a VCS organisation, and then thinking about how we sort of, who holds the risk about where some of the care for that particularly vulnerable individual might lie, and ultimately they hold the risk, right? So and we need to not infantilize people. We need to treat people as people who can manage their own situations as well. But I think there are questions there around safeguarding, and there are questions there that we need to ask about security and safety. But for me, I think the key sort of final closing comment that I have is, you know, is where we started, which is, we've done a lot in the last couple of weeks that's moved things really far forward. We still have quite a long way to go. And the key thing for me is, how do we use this next phase as really sowing the seeds for what I think could be, if we get it right, a pretty transformative legacy for the way that this borough works to support each other. And I think there's a question here about the legacy. Let's get some things right about the way that we set this future direction that means that we're working further and better together.
Thank you very much, Mike. We'll go on to Stephen next. But just, I was answering someone's question and managed to type mutilate group rather than mutual aid group, so I do apologise for that. So, Stephen, if we could get your final remarks now, please.
Yeah, I mean, hard act to follow Mike's comments. I couldn't agree more with the things he said. I mean, it's been a concern of mine for quite some time, and not just to do with COVID-19, about how we let some of those things that happen within communities just happen, and sometimes we just need to get out of the way and let people get on with it. How do we stimulate more of that sort of activity? And I think this is part of the response should we get, you know, further spikes of COVID or anything similar in the future, without forcing those organisations to be too formal and to look like us, so that we recognise them and fund them and do all that sort of stuff. So there's something in the way that we behave and the way we support organisations, speaking from the local authority perspective, that forces them to do all this stuff that they don't need to, and kind of misses the point of the good stuff that they do in their neighbourhoods. On that question of digital, which was touched on, I mean, that's really interesting, is there are some areas of service where, and of course there's lots of things that the council does that we've had to keep going through this period. Homelessness is one of those, where actually there's been some really, really positive, whilst there's an element of face-to-face service continued, lots of people really positive about transacting their business with that service online or in other ways over the phone, rather than having to go to Bournemouth Road or anywhere else to access that support. And that doesn't work for everybody, but lots of people are really positive, and I think we've learned from that experience how we build on those opportunities in terms of different ways of working. I think the level of proactive contact we've had with vulnerable people in the borough is probably more than ever before. We've learned quite a lot through that, and it's going back some time, early intervention or earlier intervention, checking up on people at a stage before they're in a crisis situation. How do we maintain that in a world where there are likely to be less resources, certainly financially, available to do it? Really keen, as Mike said, that we learn the lessons from what we've done, that we don't go back to what was normal. We keep that collaboration going, and we look at how we support the levels of voluntary activity that we've seen. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Stephen. And finally, Ross, if you could give your final statement.
Yeah, thank you. I absolutely agree with everything that's been said, really. I think one thing I would say is in terms of the duplication that happened, it was this kind of everybody doing what we do and just responding, and it was better that people got 2 food parcels than none. So we shouldn't beat ourselves up for that duplication. That was a result of positive stuff. We are learning the lessons, and it really is a drive to capture, from all parties, this way of working together, to capture the enthusiasm people have got around volunteering. With the Olympics, it was a one-off thing. Part of the problem with the Olympics is the volunteers were trained by McDonald's rather than their local volunteer centre. So 3 months after the Olympics, they thought, where did I go to find out about volunteering? Well, it was the wrong place. So we've not made some of those mistakes this time round. And I just think it's about, as Stephen just said, to not lose the prevention, the early intervention stuff, to look at the things that cause this anxiety, that cause the precariousness around people's fears about food and those kind of things, and that's something we've got to really cling on to. The other thing I guess is about, it's always struck me that in the past people would volunteer for the council for the NHS or the voluntary sector, but not the council. And I really hope we can help people see the council as something that works with them instead of something that does stuff for them or to them. So I think that's something we can really capture and build on. And it was really struck by Mike's earlier point about a vision going forward of the borough that we can all kind of share and kind of use that as a kind of guiding light to help us get to, through the next phases and get to a better place when all of this is over.
Brilliant. Thank you, Ross. And yeah, I think that is a really important point actually about that joint vision. There's a lot of questions coming up about sort of how mutual aid groups get involved, and I realise we don't have one on this particular panel, but the previous session looked a little bit deeper at that. But it is a big question about how we get a lot of different types of organisations and individuals all linked up to sort of one clear vision. And that's why this is just the very beginning of these discussions. And what we would love everyone watching to tell everyone who's not watching to get in touch with us and tell us what you think that vision should be and how you think we can support with that. So please do email us, phone us. We'll be sending out surveys and things, so do fill them in so that we can continue to have these conversations with as many different bits of the sector as well as the council and NHS as we can, to create that vision and all of the practicalities that come under it as well. Because I think one key thing that we don't want to miss is in getting quite visiony and top level, we don't want to miss out on the practical steps that make it possible for people to actually get involved. So all of that's going to take time to work out, but hopefully we can do it, and it's going to change the way Southwark responds to anything in the future for the better. So I would like to thank our panelists very much for their time and some inspiring words. And we will now go for a lunch break and come back for our session at 2 o'clock. So thank you very much, Stephen, Mike and Ross, and hopefully see everyone watching at 2 o'clock.